North Dakota, a January morning in the late 1930s, some 10 minutes before 6. A driver stood at the open door of a wood and steel school bus parked at the edge of a farmyard, breath visible, one hand on the door lever, the other testing the draft on a cast-iron stove bolted to the floor at the center of the aisle. The engine was running. The stove was not yet drawing right. He would not pull onto the county road until it was. This was not a decision written into any manual he owned, because in this decade, for a bus of this size, on a route of this kind, there was no manual that covered it. The National Conference on School Transportation had not yet met. It would not meet until later that same year, in New York, and its first 44 recommended standards would apply. At first, only to buses carrying 20 or more passengers, a category this smaller rural bus, carrying under 20 children across scattered farm stops, did not fall into. Heating specifications for a bus this size were years away from any national committee's attention. Until they arrived, what heated this bus and how safely it was managed was a decision made by one person, alone, at the edge of a farmyard, before sunrise. Factory-installed heaters were not standard equipment on rural buses of this era. Manufacturers would add them as expected equipment later, commonly cited as becoming reliable, standard passenger compartment equipment by the 1950s. In the meantime, a bus built in the 1930s, running a Northern Plains winter route, was a steel and wood box on a truck chassis with an engine that produced heat mostly for itself, near the firewall, close to where the driver's own boots sat. It did next to nothing for the rear two-thirds of the vehicle, where 30-odd feet of single-pane glass and thin sheet steel separated a child's shoulder from a wind that, on a bad morning, could push the outside temperature to 20 or 30 degrees below zero, before accounting for what the motion of the bus itself did to that number. What warmed the children inside a bus like this one was whatever the operator of that specific route had decided to install, in a decade when installed often meant exactly what it sounds like: bolted, welded, or wedged into place by someone without an engineering department to consult, working with whatever hardware a rural county seat's implement dealer or blacksmith could supply. The device this driver had installed, like a documented number of rural schools, depots, and unheated workspaces of this period, was a potbelly stove, a squat cast-iron, wood or coal-burning heater, roughly 30 inches tall, its distinctive bulge in the middle giving it its name. A fixture so common in one-room rural schoolhouses through this decade that a child getting on this bus in the morning was, in a sense, walking from one potbelly heated room into another. The stove's flat top, designed originally for a kettle or a skillet in a farmhouse kitchen or a country store, served here a narrower purpose: raw surface area to throw heat into a moving box faster than the iron body alone could manage. The difference between the schoolhouse's stove and this one was not the appliance, it was the floor beneath it. One floor held still. This one climbed a grade, dropped into a dip, crossed a plank bridge over a dry creek bed, and took the frost heaves of an unpaved county road at whatever speed a loaded bus could manage, on a morning when the surface beneath the snow was iron hard. 20-some miles of it, twice a day, for a season that in this part of the country did not reliably let go of winter before the last week of March. Before this driver could think about the route itself, which farm gate came first, which stretch of road iced over first when the sun came up and softened yesterday's crust, he had one narrower, more immediate question standing at that open door in the dark. Was the fire, right now, in the state it needed to be in before he asked it to travel? The morning did not begin at the bus door. It began earlier, in the driver's own kitchen, where a fire of a different kind, the farmhouse cook stove, had usually already been going for an hour before he ever walked out to the yard, because a rural household in this decade and this climate did not let its own heat go out overnight, any more than the bus, once the arrangement existed, could afford to run without one. The habits of managing one fire carried directly into managing the other. The same eye for a draft that was drawing too fast or too slow, the same feel for how a given grade of coal or a given cut of wood burned, the same unhurried patience with a fire that needed coaxing rather than forcing. A driver who had grown up tending a farmhouse stove did not learn the bus stove from nothing. He brought a lifetime of small, ordinary competence with him to the driver's seat, and applied it to a version of the same problem that happened, this time, to be moving. The route itself, before the stove entered the picture at all, was already a demanding piece of daily work in a northern plains winter. 20-some miles of unpaved county road meant navigating by feel as much as by sight, on a morning when blowing snow could erase the boundary between road and field entirely, when a driver's knowledge of exactly where the road ran beneath the drifts, built from 1,000 prior mornings on the same stretch, mattered as much as anything printed on a map. The stove added a second simultaneous demand on top of that first one. Not instead of watching the road, but alongside it, in the same set of eyes and the same divided attention that a rural winter route already required in full. What did it take to keep a cast-iron open-flame heater safe inside a vehicle in motion, in a decade before any state or national body had written a single word about how or whether that should be done? Before there was a heater, there was a problem, and the problem was arithmetic. A bus on a rural northern plains route in the 1930s might spend 45 minutes to an hour on the road each way, at temperatures that in a hard January could sit well below zero for a week at a stretch, with a wind that, on the open prairie, had nothing between it and the side of a school bus for miles at a time. An engine of this era threw off some heat near the front of the vehicle, close to the firewall, where the driver sat. It did almost nothing for a child in the back of a 30-foot body with a single-pane window at their shoulder, and it did nothing at all in the first several minutes of a cold start, when the engine block itself was as cold as the air around it and had no heat to spare for anyone. Districts operating on tight rural budgets, in a period before any national body had told them heating was required equipment, were not going to order factory heaters that did not yet reliably exist for this class of vehicle. And even where a rudimentary heater option existed, it was frequently underpowered for a bus running a full-length rural route rather than a short in-town hop. The solution that some operators reached for, documented broadly for rural schoolhouses, depots, and unheated public buildings of the period, and consistent with practice for buses of this kind in this region, was the same solution the schoolhouse at the end of the route already used: a potbelly stove. The potbelly stove itself was not a novel or improvised design. It was a mature, mass-produced cast-iron appliance in continuous use in American homes, general stores, train depots, and one-room schools since the 19th century, valued specifically because it was simple, durable, and effective at heating a single enclosed space with nothing more than a fuel supply and a flue. It required no electricity, a genuine advantage on rural routes where farms along the way often had none either, and it could be repaired, when it needed repairing, by the same local blacksmith or implement dealer who serviced everything else mechanical in the community. Moving one from a fixed schoolhouse floor to the floor of a vehicle that would travel 20-some miles of frost-heaved, unpaved county road twice a day did not change the stove. It changed everything around it: the mounting, which had to hold roughly 150 to 200 pounds of cast iron rigidly enough to survive a winter of washboard roads. The fuel storage, which had to be kept somewhere on or near the bus without becoming its own hazard. The flue routing, through a roof that also had to shed rain and, in season, support a roof rack of tire chains. And above all, the judgment of the person now responsible for a live fire in a space full of children that could shift, break, or take a hard bump at any point in the run. That judgment had no institutional backing. There was no inspector who came by to check the mounting bolts each fall. No state-issued checklist for how much clearance the stove needed from the nearest wooden seat frame. No minimum standard for how the flue had to be sealed where it passed through the roof panel. Everything a driver did to make this arrangement safe, he did because he had decided, on his own authority, that it needed doing. And every choice he made was, in effect, a private standard, observed by no one but himself, and eventually learned by imitation by whichever driver came after him on the same route. There was a further, quieter reason the potbelly stove made sense as a rural answer to this problem, beyond its low cost and its familiarity. It was a technology the community already knew how to keep running without outside help. A farm family that heated its own house with wood or coal, and a school board that heated its own schoolhouse the same way, already had the fuel supply chain, the seasonal habits, and the basic repair knowledge this solution required. Choosing a potbelly stove for the bus did not ask a rural district to learn anything new. It asked them to extend a piece of knowledge and infrastructure they already possessed, in every farmhouse and every schoolhouse along the route, to one additional, moving location. That is very often how rural improvisation of this kind worked in this era. Not by inventing something new, but by recognizing that a solution already trusted in one setting could be carried, with adjustment, into another. It is worth pausing on how ordinary this decision would have felt at the time, precisely because it looks so unusual from the outside today. No one involved, not the district that approved it, not the driver who maintained it, not the parents who sent their children out to ride it, would have experienced the stove as a daring or unusual measure. It was the obvious, familiar, locally sensible answer to a problem every household along the route had already solved for itself, in exactly the same way. The strangeness belongs entirely to hindsight, to a later era looking back across the standards, the inspections, and the factory-built alternatives that eventually made an open flame inside a moving vehicle full of children seem like the remarkable choice it was not experienced as being by the people who lived with it every winter morning. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980. What the bus was, how the route worked, and what the driver and the children inside it knew that no school district record ever captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses. The documented operational and human reality of a system that carried an entire generation to school. Before there was a rule about how a school bus should be heated, someone on a specific route had to decide it for themselves, and get it right every single morning, with no one checking their work but the children in the seats behind them. And if you rode a school bus in this era, or drove one, put it in the comments. If you or someone in your family rode or drove a rural bus before factory heaters were standard, what kept you warm, and who decided how? The stove in the aisle is one entry point into the much longer story of how minimum standards for school buses were written, one committee decision at a time, out of exactly this kind of improvisation. Back on the route. What the bus's design did not solve, the driver had to. What did managing a working fire inside a moving vehicle actually require of the person doing it? Every morning, for a whole winter, with no instruction sheet to consult. A working stove bolted into a moving vehicle did not run itself, and the knowledge required to run it safely belonged to no manual. It belonged to the person who did it every morning. Drivers who operated routes of this kind, in this region and decade, describe a consistent set of judgments that had to become automatic. How much wood or coal to load before a run of a given length, so the fire burned down rather than out by the time the bus reached its last stop. How to bank a fire before a downhill stretch or a hard turn, where a shifting load of embers against the firebox door was a real risk rather than a theoretical one. Which children could safely sit closest to the stove and which could not, because a coat sleeve too close to cast iron for too long was its own kind of danger. And how to read the draft on a cold morning against the draft on a milder one, because a stove that ran too hot in a closed, moving box was as much a problem as one that ran cold. None of these judgments were difficult in isolation. What made them into real expertise was that they all had to be made correctly, in sequence, before 6 in the morning, in the dark, by someone who also had a bus to drive, a schedule to keep, and 20 children's safety resting on getting every one of them right at once. This is where the general, well-documented behavior of solid fuel stoves under vibration becomes relevant, even without a single verified named incident to anchor it to. A cast-iron potbelly stove's firebox door is secured by a latch, not a weld, because the door has to open for loading and cleaning. Under the kind of sustained jolting a solid fuel stove was never engineered to withstand, the frost heaves and washboard surfaces of an unpaved county road, taken at working speed, twice a day, for a whole winter, a latch of this kind could work loose over time, its spring tension gradually fatigued by thousands of small shocks. The stove's original designer, working for a stationary schoolhouse floor, had never had reason to plan for. A district or an individual operator relying on this solution was, in effect, running an appliance built for a stationary floor inside a moving one, and every operator who did this successfully for a season did so by building, through repetition, a working sense of exactly how much give the road gave the fire before it needed checking. Which stretches of washboard road called for a hand on the latch as a precaution, which frost heaves were worth slowing for regardless of the schedule, and which mornings, when the cold was sharp enough to make the cast iron itself more brittle, called for a slower fire and more frequent checking than the calendar alone would have suggested. That sense is what this kind of route made of a driver over a winter, and it is also, precisely, the kind of knowledge that a single fixed rule cannot replace. It had to be built new, every single winter, by whoever was doing the job, because no two winters delivered exactly the same combination of cold, road condition, and fuel quality, and a rule general enough to cover every combination would have been too vague to be useful on any single morning. What worked was not a rule. It was a driver's continuously updated, entirely unwritten model of how this particular stove behaved on this particular road in this particular week of this particular winter. A model held nowhere but in his own judgment, revised every single trip. None of this appears in a school district budget line or a route sheet. It appears, if it appears anywhere, in what the children who rode behind that stove remembered afterward, not as a specification, but as a feeling, the specific smell of wood smoke inside a cold bus in the first 5 minutes of a run, before the stove had caught, the specific sound of a latch checked by a gloved hand at every stop, a small metallic click that meant nothing to a passenger and everything to the person making it, the specific quiet that fell over a bus when the driver, mid-route, reached back without looking, and pushed a coat sleeve 2 inches further from the stove's flank. A gesture made so often it had stopped requiring him to turn his head to know exactly where the sleeve and the child wearing it were sitting. This is not a claim that no child was ever too close, or that no morning ever went wrong. The record does not support that kind of blanket reassurance, and this script will not manufacture one. It is a narrower claim, and a verifiable one, that a solid fuel stove riding inside a school bus, on this kind of route, in this kind of decade, worked as safely as it did, for as many mornings as it did, because a specific, unrecorded body of knowledge was being maintained jointly by a driver and a group of children, refreshed every single day, with no institution behind it but the two of them. There was also a slower kind of knowledge a driver built across seasons rather than within a single winter. The sense of how this particular stove, this particular cast iron casting, with its own small variations in wall thickness and its own history of use, differed from a stove on a neighboring route, or from the one he had operated the year before on a different bus. No two potbelly stoves, mass-produced as the design was, behaved in exactly identical ways once each had its own years of expansion and contraction through repeated heating and cooling cycles, its own accumulated soot pattern in the flue, its own particular quirks in how evenly it distributed heat along the aisle. A driver moved from one bus to another, through a district reassignment, a vehicle replacement, or simply the ordinary churn of a rural transportation system, had to relearn this specific relationship with a specific piece of iron, the same way a farmer moving to a new piece of land had to relearn its particular soil and drainage before the knowledge that land offered became second nature again. What did the children who sat closest to that stove, and the ones who learned, without being told twice, to sit further back, carry forward from that specific daily arrangement of heat, distance, and trust? A child riding this bus twice a day, all winter, for several winters, was not thinking about latch mechanisms or fuel loads. What that child was building, without meaning to, was a different kind of knowledge, a map of the bus itself, keyed to heat and distance rather than to landmarks outside the window. They knew which seats were the warm seats and which were the cold ones, and they knew this before they could have explained why in terms of convection or airflow. They simply knew that the third row back on the left was where you wanted to be if you got there first, and that the very back row, hard against the cold rear door, was where you ended up if you were running late. They knew that the first 10 minutes of a run were the coldest part of the whole day, colder even than standing at the stop, because the stove had not yet caught and the bus's metal skin held the night's temperature until the fire worked against it, meaning the warmest-looking part of the morning, being inside, out of the wind, was, for a few minutes, colder in fact than being outside had been. They knew the specific, mixed smell of a cold bus warming, wood smoke, damp wool drying against warming skin, exhaust from the idling engine, the faint mineral smell of frost thawing off a window ledge, and they knew it the way people know the smell of their own kitchen, without noticing they had learned it, and without any way to describe it to someone who had not ridden that same bus on that same kind of morning. They knew, because it had been shown to them once, without much explanation, exactly how close was close enough and how close was too close, and they carried that knowledge the rest of the ride without needing it repeated. A 5-year-old on their first cold-weather ride did not need the rule stated twice, because the rule was demonstrated once, by an older sibling's hand or the driver's glance, and after that it simply belonged to them. Some of what they knew came directly from the driver, in small, unspoken instructions, a hand that reached back and moved a coat sleeve, a look that meant, move down one seat. A specific tone used only near the stove and nowhere else on the route. A tone the children learned to distinguish from every other tone he used. The one for a rough crossing. The one for a farm stop running late. The one, rarer, reserved only for the stove. Some of it came from each other. Older children showing younger ones where to sit on their first cold weather ride. The same way older children on any route showed younger ones which bump in the road meant they were close to school, which farmhouse belonged to which family, which stop was theirs, and which was someone else's. A child new to the route in December, arriving midwinter from another district, learned this map in a single week simply by watching where everyone else already sat, without a single word of instruction from anyone. None of it was written on a chart posted at the front of the bus. All of it worked, morning after morning, because the group of children riding this specific bus had absorbed a shared, unstated set of rules about heat and proximity, the way children absorb the rules of any small, repeated world they belong to. A set of rules more binding, in practice, than most of the ones written down for them at school, because these were rules they had watched work, every day, with their own eyes. This is not a claim that no child was ever too close, or that no morning ever went wrong. The record does not support that kind of blanket reassurance, and this script will not manufacture one. It is a narrower claim, and a verifiable one, that a solid fuel stove riding inside a school bus, on this kind of route, in this kind of decade, worked as safely as it did, for as many mornings as it did, because a specific, unrecorded body of knowledge was being maintained jointly by a driver and a group of children, refreshed every single day, with no institution behind it but the two of them. This knowledge did not stay confined to the bus itself. Children carried it into the schoolhouse, where the same rules about distance and heat applied around the same kind of stove, and carried it home again in the evening, where a farmhouse's own wood or coal stove asked the same basic judgment of them at an age when most of what they knew about fire they had learned first from a driver's unspoken instruction rather than from a parent's. In this sense, the bus was not only transportation between two heated buildings, it was itself a kind of instruction, a daily, repeated lesson in how to live safely alongside an open flame in an enclosed space, taught by nobody in particular, absorbed by everybody who rode it, and carried forward into every other heated room a child of this era was likely to spend time in. What happened to that specific jointly held knowledge, the driver's half and the children's half together, the day this particular arrangement of heat and distance stopped existing? Before you can understand why a driver on a route like this one was the one making decisions that a later generation would consider obviously the school districts or the states to make, you need to understand what no national standard meant for rural American school transportation in this specific window of time. The first National Conference on School Transportation, called for the sole purpose of establishing recommended standards, met in 1939 and produced 44 of them, including the exterior color that would eventually be known nationwide as National School Bus Glossy Yellow. Those standards applied at first to buses of 20 or more passengers. A second conference, in 1945, at Jackson's Mill, West Virginia, extended standards to the smaller vehicles, 10 to 18 passengers, that a route like the one this episode documents was more likely to use, and revised the 1939 recommendations. Further revisions followed roughly every few years after that, through 1948, 1951, 1954, and beyond, each one narrowing the range of decisions left to individual districts and drivers. What this means, Concretely, is that for a rural route of the specific size and kind discussed here, running before or just after the 1945 conference, questions that a district transportation supervisor would later answer from a specifications manual were, in this window, genuinely open questions, decided locally, by whoever was closest to the problem. Heating a bus this size was one of those questions. So was how many children could safely ride, what kind of door the bus needed, and what the driver was expected to do in an emergency. National standards did not appear all at once, fully formed, in 1939. They accumulated, conference by conference, over roughly 3 decades, each revision absorbing lessons that had first been learned, sometimes safely, sometimes not, out on individual routes like this one, by individual drivers making individual judgment calls with no committee behind them. It is worth being precise about what a recommended standard from one of these conferences actually was in this era, because the word standard can suggest more legal force than the document carried. These were recommendations, produced by representatives of state departments of education, motor vehicle agencies, and school transportation officials, meeting periodically to compare notes and publish a shared specification, a model other states and districts could adopt, in whole or in part, on their own schedule. Adoption was not simultaneous or automatic. A state legislature or a state department of education had to decide, separately, to write a given recommendation into its own requirements, and a rural district within that state then had to receive, understand, and apply it to its existing fleet. A fleet that, in a Depression era or immediate post-war rural county, was rarely replaced all at once. A bus already in service when a new recommendation was published did not vanish and reappear compliant. It kept running, exactly as built, until the district's budget and priorities allowed for a change, which in the case of an ad hoc solid fuel heater already installed and already working, could be a genuinely low priority next to keeping the bus's brakes, tires, and engine serviceable through another winter. The stove in this bus's aisle, in other words, was not an aberration from a system that already had rules for how buses should be heated. It was one small specific instance of the condition every rural route operated under before those rules existed, and for some years even after the first rules existed but had not yet reached, or been enforced on, a specific bus on a specific county road. The driver was the standard. This condition was not unique to heating, and it is worth naming the wider pattern it belonged to, because it explains why a single stove in a single bus's aisle is worth an episode of its own. Before the standards process matured, nearly every operational question a rural bus route raised, how many children could safely stand in the aisle when seats ran short, what the driver should do if the bus became stuck on an impassable stretch of road, how a door should latch so it neither jammed shut nor swung open on a rough crossing, was answered the same way the heating question was answered, locally, provisionally, by a person on the ground rather than a body of specialists working from accumulated data. The stove is a single, vivid, physically dramatic example of a condition that touched the entire vehicle, the entire route, and the entire relationship between a district and the families it served. It is also worth noting what this process looked like from the perspective of the people who eventually wrote these standards, because they were not distant bureaucrats inventing rules in a vacuum. The representatives who gathered for the 1939 and 1945 conferences were themselves drawn substantially from state departments of education and motor vehicle administration, many with direct experience of exactly the kind of rural transportation problems this episode describes, even if not this specific solution. Their recommendations when they eventually addressed heating, ventilation, door mechanisms, and emergency exits, were not arbitrary impositions on rural practice. They were, in large part, a codification of exactly the kind of hard-won, individually developed knowledge this episode has been describing. An attempt, however imperfect and however slow to reach every county road, to take what a generation of individual drivers had learned through trial, error, and daily judgment, and make it available to every district and every driver who came after, without requiring each of them to learn it the same way, alone, from scratch. Back to the route. A stove-heated bus on a route like this one was not only a heating solution, it was, without anyone designing it that way, a small mobile extension of the same community institution the route was built to serve, the rural schoolhouse itself, which in this era was very often heated by the same kind of appliance. This is not a metaphor stretched to fit. It is a documented continuity. Potbelly stoves of the kind installed in some rural buses of this period were, in this same decade, the standard heat source for the one-room schoolhouses that made up the vast majority of rural American schools, numbering, at their national peak, somewhere near 200,000 buildings, with a large share concentrated in the Midwest and Great Plains, the exact region this episode is set in. A child boarding a stove-heated bus in the morning and arriving at a stove-heated schoolhouse 20 minutes later was not experiencing two different systems. They were experiencing the same solution to the same problem, applied twice in one commute, by people solving it independently with the materials and knowledge available to them. The district that ordered coal for the schoolhouse in the fall very likely also arranged fuel for the bus, from the same supplier, at the same time, without necessarily treating them as two separate line items in anyone's accounting. The practice of heating a rural pupil transport vehicle with a stove is itself documented in the historical record, not, in the case most thoroughly confirmed by this search, for a motorized bus in North Dakota or Montana, but for a horse-drawn school conveyance in Daviess County, Missouri, driven by a man named James Douglas Lawler for the Altamont School around 1936, recorded by local historians as having carried, in their words, a heating stove for those long, cold trips. The vehicle type differs from the one this episode centers on, a horse-drawn wagon rather than a motorized bus, and the region differs, Missouri rather than North Dakota or Montana. The underlying practice does not differ. A rural district or an individual operator facing the same cold weather arithmetic this episode has been documenting, reaching for the same stove technology already trusted in the schoolhouse, and installing it in the conveyance itself. This is a real record, a real name, and a real date, standing as documented confirmation of exactly the kind of improvisation this episode describes in a Northern Plains, motorized bus context where the individually documented account could not be located. The general practice verified even where the single specific instance in this region could not be. What this continuity meant socially was that the bus was never entirely separate from the school it served, not in its heating solution, not in its relationship to the community, and not, most days, in the driver, who in many small rural districts of this era was a known local figure rather than a district employee arriving from outside the community. He might farm the section next to one of his own stops. He might sit on the school board that had hired him, or be related by marriage to half the families along his route. His authority over the bus and over the stove in its aisle was not backed by a supervisor's office in a county seat 40 miles away. It was backed by the fact that every family whose children he carried saw him, most weeks, somewhere other than behind that wheel, at church, at the grain elevator, at the crossroads store, and would hear about it directly, by name, in person, if something on his route ever went wrong. That structure of accountability, informal as it was, did real work. A driver who mismanaged the stove or let a child sit too close once too often was not answering to a distant inspector on a schedule of annual reviews. He was answering, that same evening or the next Sunday, to the parent of the child involved, standing across a counter or a church aisle from him, in a community too small for the matter to go unmentioned. This same closeness cut in both directions. A family that trusted a known local driver with a stove-heated bus was extending a form of confidence that had nothing to do with any certificate, inspection, or state license. A confidence built the same way trust is built between any two people who share a small community over years, by watching, repeatedly, how someone behaved when something went slightly wrong, and by the accumulated evidence of a route run safely, morning after morning, for as long as anyone could remember it running any other way. That confidence was, in its own informal fashion, exactly the kind of safety assurance a later, more bureaucratic system would eventually try to formalize and guarantee for every family, everywhere, regardless of whether they personally knew their children's driver. A genuine improvement in consistency and fairness, even as it replaced something that had, in its own local and particular way, also worked. What did it mean for a driver to be, in effect, a known extension of the school itself, accountable not to a supervisor in an office, but to families who saw him at church, at the feed store, and at the end of their own lane every single morning? The stove did not disappear from rural buses because of a single accident, a single headline, or a single dramatic morning. The record available for this episode does not support that kind of tidy turning point, and this script will not invent one. It disappeared the way most improvised solutions disappear once an institution catches up to the problem they were solving. Gradually, unevenly, region by region, as three separate forces converged on the same outcome from different directions. The first force was the standards process itself. Each successive National Conference on School Transportation, from 1945 forward, narrowed the range of what individual districts were permitted to leave to local judgment, and heating specifications for smaller vehicles, the exact class of bus this episode centers on, were part of that narrowing. A solid fuel, open flame appliance bolted to a moving floor was, by any standard eventually written by people whose job was to think about school bus safety full-time, exactly the kind of hazard a specification process exists to remove. As successive conferences in 1948, 1951, and 1954 revised and tightened the 1945 recommendations, the space left for an individual district to decide, on its own, that an open-flame stove was an acceptable answer to a heating problem grew steadily smaller, even in states that were slow to formally adopt each round of recommendations. The second force was mechanical, not regulatory. Factory-installed heaters, drawing warmth from the engine's own cooling system, rather than requiring a separate fuel and flame, became progressively more common and more effective through the 1940s and into the 1950s, until they were reliable enough that a district no longer had a practical reason to solve the cold with fire. This is, in a narrow sense, simpler and less dramatic than a story of prohibition. The stove was not banned into obsolescence, so much as outcompeted by an easier, safer answer to the same arithmetic problem it had always been solving. A heater that ran off the engine's own waste heat required no separate fuel purchase, no ash to clean out, no latch to check, and no driver's private judgment standing between a cold morning and a warm bus. Once that technology was affordable and dependable enough for a rural district's budget, the practical case for keeping a stove in the aisle weakened even where no inspector ever specifically ordered it removed. The third force was consolidation itself, and it did not merely change how a route was heated, it erased a large number of the specific routes this kind of solution had been built for. One-room rural schools, numbering close to 200,000 nationally at their peak, fell to roughly 50,000 by the early 1950s and continued declining through the following 2 decades, as improved rural roads and post-war school building programs made centralized, larger schools both possible and, to reformers of the period, clearly preferable. Iowa, to take one documented example, required by state law that all remaining public one-room schools close by June of 1966. Other states followed comparable, if not identical timelines through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Each school that closed took its short local route with it, and with that short route went the specific, close relationship between one driver, one stove, and one group of children that this episode has been documenting, replaced, where a replacement existed at all, by a longer consolidated route, a larger and differently equipped bus, and very often a driver who had not grown up among the families whose children he now carried. These three forces did not operate on the same calendar in every state, or even in every county within a single state. A rural district in one part of the northern plains might retire its last stove-heated bus in the mid-1940s, as soon as a factory-heated replacement became available and affordable. A poorer or more remote district nearby might keep a stove-heated bus in service into the early 1950s, simply because the vehicle still ran, the stove still worked, and the district's budget had other, more urgent priorities than replacing equipment that was doing its job. The end of this practice, in other words, was not a single date. It was a slow, uneven withdrawal, district by district, as each one reached the point where a safer, easier alternative became available and affordable enough to be worth the change. For the driver himself, this transition rarely arrived as a single dramatic morning either. It arrived, more often, as a series of small, cumulative changes to a job he had done one way for years. A new bus, assigned to his route with a heater already built in. A stove quietly retired to a district storage shed rather than removed in any ceremony. A set of duties that had once required his constant, private judgment, now governed instead by a printed maintenance schedule someone else had written. Some drivers welcomed this. One less thing to manage before dawn, one less risk resting on their own shoulders alone. Others, according to the general pattern documented for long-tenure rural workers across many trades in this era of standardization, experienced it more ambivalently, a genuine relief alongside a quieter sense that a piece of skill they had spent years building and took real pride in, no longer had anywhere to be used. What replaced this arrangement, factory heat, standardized routes, larger consolidated schools, solved real problems the old arrangement had not solved well. What it could not carry forward was the specific, jointly held knowledge of heat and distance that a driver and a particular set of children had built together, morning by morning, for as long as that particular bus, that particular stove, and that particular route existed together. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these routes and in the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more drivers, and more children's geographies that were built by daily repetition and never written down. Every episode on this channel starts from the same premise, that the operational history of the American school bus is inseparable from the human knowledge it required, and that both deserve documentation with the same rigor a historian would bring to any other institution that shaped an entire generation's daily life. No later safety system, not the factory heater, Not the national standard, not the consolidated route with its larger, better-equipped bus. Replace the specific thing a driver and a group of children built together around a stove, bolted to an aisle floor. A shared, daily, wordless understanding of exactly how much risk was in the room and exactly how to manage it together, refreshed every single cold morning by two parties who trusted each other because they had no other choice. The factory heater made that particular trust unnecessary going forward, which was, on balance, a genuine improvement in safety and reliability. It is possible for a change to be a real improvement and for something specific and real to have been lost in the same transition, without either fact canceling the other out. This episode has tried to hold both of those things at once, rather than choosing the easier, one-sided version of the story. And if you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a route, a stove that kept you warm, or a coat sleeve someone once moved without asking, put it in the comments. If you or someone in your family rode or drove a rural bus before factory heaters were standard, what kept you warm, and who decided how? If your family's route ran through the northern plains, or through Missouri, or anywhere else this kind of improvisation was practiced, we would like to know what you remember, and where. The stove in the aisle is one entry point into the much longer story of how minimum standards for school buses were written, one committee decision at a time, out of exactly this kind of improvisation. And that longer story, conference by conference, decade by decade, is where this channel goes next. The 1948 revisions that tightened emergency exit requirements, the 1954 conference that took up the question of bus body construction more formally, and the long, slow process by which every element of the vehicle this episode has described, its heat, its doors, its seating, its very color, went from being a local operator's private judgment to a nationally recommended and eventually a state-mandated specification. Each of those future episodes will follow the same method this one has: a documented vehicle, a documented route, and the specific, verifiable knowledge of the people who operated inside a system before that system had fully caught up to them. Between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, districts across the northern plains and the wider rural Midwest replaced solid-fuel bus heaters with factory-installed, engine-driven systems as those systems became reliable, and national conference standards, revised roughly every few years from 1945 onward, steadily narrowed the range of decisions individual drivers had once made on their own. What the factory heater gave the children who rode after it: warmth from the moment the engine started, no fire to tend, no latch to check. What it did not give them: the specific, shared knowledge of exactly how close was too close, built together, morning after morning, by a driver and the particular group of children riding behind him. One-room rural schools, the schools these stove-heated routes most often served, fell from close to 200,000 nationally at their peak to roughly 50,000 by the early 1950s, and continued to close through the following 2 decades. Each closure erased not just a building, but the short, local route built to serve it, and the specific daily arrangement between one driver and one group of children that had grown up inside that route. The stove itself, where it survived at all, did not survive as a working appliance. A handful ended up cold and disconnected in the county historical societies and small local museums that began collecting the material culture of one-room school life once that life had clearly and finally ended. A preserved artifact behind a card of identifying text, illustrating a technology, but incapable of illustrating the judgment that had once kept it safe inside a moving vehicle. That judgment was never an object. It could not be preserved behind glass, because it had never existed anywhere except inside the ongoing daily practice of one specific driver and one specific group of children, and it ended, necessarily and completely, the moment that specific practice stopped being repeated. No record kept track of what any of this cost. No line in a district budget was written for the loss of a specific, unspoken system of trust between a driver and the children who had learned, without being told twice, exactly how close was close enough. This is not a story with a villain, or a single decision that, made differently, would have preserved what was lost. The factory heater was safer. The national standards prevented real harm. The old improvised arrangements sometimes failed to prevent. The consolidated school offered curricula and facilities no one-room schoolhouse could match, and gave many children opportunities their parents had not had. Every documented force behind this change was, on its own terms, a genuine improvement, and the specific, local, jointly built knowledge this episode has traced was still, genuinely and completely, lost in the process, because that is what happens to knowledge of this kind. It does not get preserved by the systems that replace it, because those systems were never designed to carry it, only to solve the narrower, measurable problem the old arrangement had also, imperfectly, been solving. It simply ended, route by route, as the routes themselves ended, and what had been known was not transferred. There was no one left whose job it was to carry it forward.